Well, can you believe it? You've finished your basic groups and you're now into the chapter on complex groups. Complex groups. The examiner imagines the subject of complex groups essentially to be complex group structures. In real life, complex group structures can get genuinely really complicated. Here in the UK we have a culture of relatively simple group structures, and even here in the UK they can get pretty complicated. But around the world, especially East Asian entities, Korean in particular, but also Chinese, Singaporean, East Asian, Japanese entities often have a group structure of the sort of nature that we're going to look at, which is the parent owns the sub owns the sub-sub, and there's a bit of ownership around the outside, etc., etc. Now, when you get these vertical group structures, when you get these complex webs of ownership between the parent, the ultimate parent, and the other members of the group, where you get this complex web type structure, the examiner describes that as being complex groups. So that's your complex groups. Now, complex group accounting is basically group accounting. So everything you learned in the chapter on basic group accounting still applies now, and nothing has really changed. However, there are two complications that make complex groups that little bit more complex. And frankly, those two complications are really minor compared to the basic group accounting. So when you're doing complex groups, never forget that you are doing complex groups, but you're basically just doing groups. Okay, so you're doing group accounting. But it is actually possible to retain ownership of a subsidiary whilst having less than 50% ownership. And that's particularly true when you have complex groups, when you have a vertical group structure. And in order to illustrate this point, we've got a couple of questions, and if I remember correctly, the names are ACR and PDQ. So let's find those in the chapter on complex groups. I've got my copy down here on the left, as you can see me looking down. I'm just flicking through my chapters. There we go. Complex groups with vertical group structure. We've got the question ACR and the question PDQ. So here we go. Shall we have a go at that together? So we've got vertical groups. The first question is called ACR and has a vertical group structure like this. And the ownership percentages are given in the question. Here's the copy of the question for me. Parent A buys 60% of C, which in turn buys 60% of R. And the question is calculate the non-controlling interest in the group. Yeah, nice question. Essentially that means the NCI of R. So we need to first of all work out the ownership percentage of R. Well, the ownership is equal to 60% of 60%, and therefore 36%. And therefore, as you can see, we have less than 50% ownership, 36% ownership. And the temptation, therefore, is to think that we only have influence and therefore only an associate. But it's wrong. As you can see from the structure up here on my left-hand side, A owns 60% of C, and C owns 60% of R, and therefore A has absolute control of C and R. Now, in order to have control, you need to be able to sack the players in the lower entity. Now, if anyone argues with us down in R, if anyone argues with us down in R, we in A can tell the guys in C to sack them. And C has greater than 60%, sorry, I do apologise, greater than 50% of the ownership, therefore has a majority and the ability to pass a majority resolution. So if we tell C to sack R, they will. And if anyone in C argues with us, well, we'll sack them. So we have an unbroken chain of ordinary resolutions available to us within the entire group. So not only do we control C, we also control R. But our ownership has fallen below 50%. So it's a good job that they changed the name from minority interest to non-controlling interest. Because the NCI is the amount we control, which is the entire entity, minus what we own, which is 36%. So we own 36%, but it controls the entire entity, and therefore the non-controlling interest is 64%. And I mentioned something very briefly there, didn't I? Minority interest. NCI, non-controlling interest, used to be called minority interest, but obviously that was wrong. And a recent improvement that happened in financial reporting is the change of minority interest to being described as being non-controlling interest, NCI. And I think that's an improvement, and as you can see from these numbers here, it kind of makes sense, because actually the minority interest is in the majority. They don't actually have any control whatsoever, because we have control, but they do have the majority of the ownership. So we have absolute control, but we have ownership of 36%, and therefore the NCI is 64%. Okay, let's do it again. So the next question is PDQ. P buys 75% of D, which buys 64% of Q. P, D, Q. %, 64%. Our ownership in the lower entity is equal to 75% of the 64%, and therefore 48%. But despite having less than half of the ownership of the lower entity Q, we in P have control because we can tell D what to do. And D can pass an ordinary resolution to sack the directors in Q. So we can sack the directors in Q. We in P can sack the directors in Q because we can tell D to sack the directors. We have an unbroken chain of majority resolutions throughout the group. So we have absolute control, but partial ownership, and the NCI, the non-controlling interest, is the amount that we do control, which is the entire thing, minus what we own, which is 48%. So 52% belongs to the guys who do not have control. Okay, that's enough of an introduction. We now need to do a question. And the question that we're going to do is Hendrix. And it's just immediately below PDQ. So the question is Hendrix. Hendrix acquired shares in 70, which in turn acquired shares in Super 70 many years ago. At acquisition, S and S reserves were 60,000 and 30,000 respectively. Goodwill has been subject to an impairment review at each year end since acquisition, however no impairment has occurred. It is the group's policy to value the non-controlling interest at its proportionate share of the fair value of the subsidiary's net assets. In other words, the partial goodwill assumption is being used. The statements of financial position are as follows, and there they are. We need a group statement of financial position. Now, personally, I tend not to bother with a group structure unless the group structure becomes complicated. I would argue, in the case of Hendrix, that this is a complex group structure, and therefore would suggest to you that it is worth writing out that little baby structure that you see just there. So we'll have that little structure there. But we don't have ownership percentage in Hendrix. We don't have ownership percentages in Hendrix. What we do have is ownership of shares. Can you see that S has purchased 6,000 shares in SS, and we in H have purchased 14,000 shares in the middle entity S? Do you see that? So if we have taken ownership of 14,000 shares, how big is the population in S? Can you see 20,000 shares in S's balance sheet? We have 70% ownership in the mid-sub. How much ownership does the mid-sub have of the lower sub? Well, the share capital down in the lower sub as a whole is 10,000. And of that 10,000, the mid-sub owns 6,000. Do you see that from the balance sheet? That's 60%. So, changing colour as I can with this clever computer. The ownership of the group in the lower entity, SS, is 70%, 70% of 60%. What is that figure? Is that, what am I doing here? 70% is 60%. 6 times 7. Is that 42? Oh, my maths is falling apart. So, yeah, 42, I think. But I'm going to check it with my trusty Casio. Out comes the Casio. Yeah. So 0.7 times by 0.6. 0.42. So 42%. So my brain must have been in a barrel there for a moment. But it seems to have come alive thanks to trusty Casio. So our ownership is 42%. And therefore our NCI is, 100% minus 42% is equal to 58%. But actually, to be quite frank with you, there are actually two NCI. That is our NCI in the lower sub. Our NCI in the lower sub is 58. That's right, isn't it? Our NCI in the lower sub is 58%. But the NCI in the mid sub, can you see our ownership in the mid sub is 70%? So if our ownership in the mid sub is 70%, our NCI in the mid sub is 30%. So because there's two entities over which we have absolute control but partial ownership, there are two NCI. The NCI in the mid sub is 30% and the NCI in the lower sub is 58%. So there's two NCI. Right, okay, well this question doesn't merely ask us to, construct a group structure. It also asks us to go as far as a group statement of financial position. So we do our usual stuff. We work out the net assets at the various points that are relevant. Now the 2 points that are relevant are at acquisition and at the year end. But there's two entities, aren't there? There's the mid-sub and the sub-sub. So we've got the mid-sub at acquisition and at year end, and then we've got the sub-sub at acquisition and at the year end. Share capital doesn't change. Share capital doesn't change. But but obviously reserves do. How big were the reserves at acquisition? 60 and 30. So the entity was sized 80, is now 250, was sized 40, is now 100. And the principal aim of this calculation, the net assets calculation, is to enable us to calculate goodwill. So we're going to calculate the goodwill, and I think I'm going to put them next to each other. Yeah, I'm going to put them next to each other. So a bit of a squeeze. The fair value of consideration is compared to the fair value of the NCI to give you the fair value of the entire business. And then that is compared to the fair value of the net assets to give you the goodwill. And I'm going to have my usual structure where I go percentage, working, sub, then percentage, working, sub. So it is a bit of a squeeze, but like I say, I think it's worth the effort. There we go. Now, working first of all on the mid-sub, the fair value of consideration that was paid by us, H, was 60,000, as you can see. 60,000. Now, the fair value of consideration gave us a 70% ownership, and therefore the NCI was 30% ownership. Now, I've mentioned before that the examiner is likely, in your exam, to focus upon the full goodwill assumption, but that he has specifically said that the partial goodwill assumption is available within the IFRS, and therefore it is still examinable. Now, what I've decided to do with these two questions is to do the first one partial goodwill, and then to do the second one full goodwill. I think the full goodwill question is more likely. But then the question to me is, where are these two questions? Well, the first one's Hendrix, which is just there, right? And the one that we're going to do in the next video is just over the page, and that's the question called D, slight return. Now, D is based upon the examiner's article question, where he does the full goodwill assumption for what's called a D group. Now, really, to be honest with you, the most important of the introductory questions within this section is the question D, which I'll be recording to the next video. Now, D is the most important one. It has the full goodwill assumption, and that's the one that's coming up later. But I decided, just to be on the safe side, to do it both ways. So this one, first of all, we're going to do the partial goodwill assumption. So this one's based on the partial goodwill assumption. Now, the partial goodwill assumption, as the policy states, is based upon the idea that the NCI is equal to the proportionate share of the fair value of the subsidiary's net assets. Now, the proportion, as you can see, is 30%, and the net assets are just above the 80. So the value of the NCI at acquisition is just its ownership in the net assets, which is 80 times by 0.3 is 24. So their bit of the business is worth 24, our bit of the business is worth 60, and therefore the whole business is worth 84. But the net assets are 80, and therefore the goodwill is the premium of 4. And that's the first goodwill. Okay? Now the second goodwill works in, the same basis, but you've just got to be careful with the fair value of consideration. Now, of course, our ownership up in H is only 42% in the sub-sub, and 58% is the ownership of the NCI ownership. Now, it's a little tricky this, but it is important, and I think you should try and get it right. Do you see the 50 in S's books? Do you see where it says investment in SS? 50. Well, that 50 that's in S's books is in S's books, and we are not S. So the question is, how much did we spend when they spent 50? Well, what is our ownership in S? Well, I don't know. Who are we in this story? Well, we, of course, are H. And every time that S spends £1, we spend 70p. Every time that S spends $1, we spend 70 cents. Because that's our ownership. So every time that S spends $1 on stock, we spend 70 cents on stock. So every time that S spends $1 on shares, we spend 70 cents. So if they spend $50,000, then we spend 70% of that, which is 35. So our cost of our consideration up in the parent, the ultimate parent, is 35. And then the NCI is just done in the usual way. 58% of the size of the net assets of 40. The net assets of 40, I'll just highlight for you, just to remind you, but the net assets at acquisition were 80 in one entity and 40 in the one we're doing now. So looking at that 40, we've got 40 times by 0.58, 23.2. So their bit of the business is worth 23.2. Our bit of the business is worth 35. So the entire business is worth 58.2. And the net assets themselves are 40. And therefore that gives 18.2, right? So it's a bit silly using my calculator, but I'm feeling a bit shaky mathematically, so I'm glad I checked that. 18.2 therefore is the goodwill. And that's it, really. And then we slap both goodwills onto the balance sheet. I was going to write consolidated there, but I actually prefer the word group. It's all just a matter of choice, right? But I prefer the word group. So group position statement, I think I'll call it. There's 3 entities in the group, 2 of which were acquired, 2 of which are subsidiaries, the lower one and the very lower one. We've got goodwill in the mid-sub of 4, goodwill in the lower sub of 18.2, and therefore we've got 22.2 in goodwill. Net assets, we have absolute control of the entire net assets. Maybe I'll call it other net assets. We've got 300, we control that, 200, we control that, and 100, we control that. So 622 on the top half of the balance sheet, and I guess we're going to get the same number at the bottom. So share capital. The group position statement will go to the group shareholders, and the group shareholders are actually the parent shareholders, and they hold shares to the tune of 30,000. Then we have the reserves, And then we have the NCI, the non-controlling interest. Now, frankly, neither of these things are particularly easy in this particular question. Usually, actually, the reserves are harder than the NCI, but in this case, I would probably argue it's the other way around. But because usually the NCI is easier, I'm going to do the NCI first. So the NCI. Well, the first thing about NCI is there are actually two of them. There's the NCI in S and the NCI in SS. Now, I still feel a little bit not too sure about the examiner's roll-forward technique on NCI. I do confess that it does have certain advantages, and more to the point, it is the examiner's technique, so I'm going to suggest we do it that way. So the roll-forward technique basically starts with the NCI at acquisition and then rolls it forward. Once we've got the balance at the end, then we'll add across and then add down, and that will be the NCI. Okay, so that's the basic plan. Now, the NCI at acquisition is not given. We have to pick it up from our own workings because of the proportionate assumption. So there's the 24 and the 23.2, which were the NCI at acquisition. So we've got the NCI 24 and 23.2. So 24 and 23.2. And, and we're going to add in the growth. But as I have symbolised here, see that? There's a little minus sign. There's more to it. It is almost impossible to remember this. I think that it is almost impossible to remember this. But part of the NCI in the mid-sub is the NCI in the lower sub. That's really complicated, that, isn't it? But part of the NCI in the mid-sub is NCI in the lower sub. Part of what that 24 is, the NCI in S, is actually NCI in the shares in the SS. And you have to strip out the shares in SS to prevent double counting. It is almost impossible to remember, I think. So we strip SS from S. Now, because of the way that the examiner chooses to do this, I think it is really tricky to see this, and essentially you either learn it or you just ignore it because it hardly makes any difference whatsoever to your final answer. But that 24, do you see that 24 there? That 24 there, which is the ownership of the non-controlling interest in S, includes the non-controlling interest ownership in SS, the 50. And the percentage of the 50 that they own is 30%, because that's the NCI percentage in the mid-sub. Now, the reason that we need to strip out, I think the reason that you need to do it is quite obvious, but actually picking up the little detail is really, really tricky. Now, you've got parent, sub, and sub-sub, right? Okay. Now, when you're doing S, you want to be doing pure S, and when you're doing SS, you want to be doing pure SS. Well, there isn't really a problem with SS, but the problem is with S. When you're doing S, you only want to be doing S, and not S and SS. But the thing is about S is not only an entity in its own right, it is also a parent of a subsidiary. So anytime you do S, you're inevitably doing S and SS. So in order to get pure S, you've got to strip out SS. And that's what you have to do. So how much SS is in S? Well, I don't know. Have a look at the balance sheet. And when you look at the balance sheet, the amount of the balance sheet, can you see it? The amount of the balance sheet that is SS, that is in S, is 50. And how much is the NCI in that 50? Well, it's 30% of that 50 is NCI in SS. So to prevent you from including SS twice in your calculation, you have to strip out the lower sub from the mid sub. Why, yeah. And actually, well, I don't know if I really want to go this far, but I seem to have started. Actually, the acquisition NCI in the mid-sub was 24, wasn't it? But that 24 was partly S and partly SS. You can see the amount that was SS. The amount that was SS is 30% of 50, which is 15. So 15 of the 24 is actually SS. So pure SS is the rest of the 24. 15 from 24 gives you 9. So the pure S acquisition NCI, the NCI at acquisition in purely S was only quite a small 9. And we start from that 9 and then grow that. Goodness me. So the growth. Anyway, what was the growth? Well, the growth in the entity was, where are we now? Should we use a bit of purple? Was from 80 to 250, as you can see, from 80 to 250. So it's, oops, wrong way around. 250 minus 80, and 30% of that belongs to the NCI, so I'll change back to black. So, adding across and giving comments as I do so, the NCI given in the question was 24, but of that 24, 15 of it, what happened there? 24. The NCI given from our calculation was 24 at acquisition, but 15 of that 24 actually relates to the lower sub, to the sub-sub. So the pure mid-sub acquisition NCI is 9, and the growth in that is 250 minus 80. So 250 minus 80, the growth is 170, belonging to the NCI is 0.3 of that, 51. 51 plus the original 9 is 60. Goodness me, it's 60. Not actually my favourite way of working out that NCI. There's lots of different ways of working out these numbers, and that's not really my favourite. But it does seem to be the favourite of the examiner, and I have to confess, although it's rather difficult in this question, it does give you the advantage in the next question in D. It does have advantages in D. There's nothing, there's nothing I can do to say that the examiner hasn't got it right when it comes to D. So if it works for D, and that's the more likely one, then we should use the same method throughout. Now, the great thing about this, the sub-sub down at the bottom, is the sub-sub is the bottom of the pile, and therefore the sub-sub has no ownership in anyone else, so it's automatically purely itself. So there's no need to do any stripping out of the 23.2, thank goodness. So sticking with the idea of using purple, the growth in the sub-sub is from 40 up to 100, and therefore 60. 100 minus 40, and therefore 60. What are we saying here? What was the NCI ownership? 58%, wasn't it? 58. And changing back to black. There we go. So we've got 60 times by 0.58 equals 34.8 plus the original 23.2 gives us 58. That's quite a nice round number. So that gives us a figure of 118. And then 118 gets slotted into position up there. So there we go, 118. Now the NCI, as I say, traditionally is the easier of the two figures at the bottom of the balance sheet. But I suggest to you that that calculation is made a little bit more complicated, is made, you could argue, substantially more complicated by this process of stripping out the lower sub from the mid sub. Now, in the examination, you're going to try and remember to do that, but if you forget, it's half a mark. It happens, right? So yes, sure, you can try and remember to do that process of stripping out, but if you forget, everyone's human, everyone makes mistakes, so the main thing is to bash through this question and not worry too much about that minor little tickle at the end. Because let's face it, when it comes to the reserves, they're okay. Said I was going to use black, didn't I? So here we go, reserves. We've got parent, sub, and sub-sub. So the parent profits in the parent bucket as at the year end are 330. The growth in the sub was, what was it again? Was it 250 minus 80? That rings a bell. Of which 70% is ours. And it was a growth up to 100 from 40, of which 42% is ours. We work that across, we add down. So 250 minus 80 equals 170 times by 0.7 is 119. And 60 times by 0.42 is 25.2. Plus 119 plus 330 is 474.2. So it's been a while since I've done this question. So let's see if it does balance. 474.2. 474.2, taking that up. 474.2 plus 30 plus 118 is equal to 622.2. 622.2. Miraculous! It balances. What's the chances of that happening in the exam? Absolute zero. There's no chance, is there? Now you can see that technique is well worth practicing. In fact, what I have planned for you is 2 more questions. We've got 1 more illustrative question, which I'm going to record to the next video. And then in fact, we have our first examination question, which is coming up immediately after that. Okay, I'm finished there. Well done. Practice that introductory question, Hendrix, before you have a go at the next one, because it's quite full on the next one. Okay.